Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 76, The Forgotten Army, A.K. To most military officials in Britain and the United States, the most valued contribution of the Polish Home Army to the war effort was the intelligence it provided to the Allies. The ZWZ, or AK, was responsible for informing the British about the German preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union months before it occurred, the German drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, and the identification of the German rocket site at Peenemünde. End quote. From The Forgotten Holocaust by Robert Lucas. Welcome to episode 76 of Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world that focuses on the entire Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, also called Ottawa, Canada, a country that is free, independent, and sovereign, and will remain so. And I'm joined in the Redbeard studio by my assistant, Daisy the Danger Doodle. Say hi, Daisy. Very good, Daisy. Last episode recapped the progress of the war, or mostly the progress of the Red Army from 1943 to May 1944, bringing us back up to our regular tracking of the progress of the Eastern Front of the Second World War 81 years later. And now, with something big coming up very soon, and you history buffs know what I'm talking about, we need to pause to look more fully at an army that hasn't gotten enough attention on this podcast, and really doesn't get the attention it deserves anywhere in the West. Today's subject was a large army operating in the Eastern European theater of the war. It scored some major victories, suffered some terrible losses, and had a powerful impact on the war from east to the west. I'm talking about the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. Before I get into the details, I apologize in advance for any mangling of the Polish pronunciation that I may commit. I'm just a guy from Winnipeg after all. What was the Home Army? Armia Krajowa is Polish for Home Army. In effect, the organized underground resistance in occupied Poland. It encompassed a number of different groups of civilians and military people, and at its height reached as many as 380,000 members. It was loyal to the Polish Government-in-Exile in London, but not always completely under its control. So, to understand the Armia Krajowa fully, we have to back up just a little to 1939. As you know, Germany invaded Poland starting on 1st September 1939. On 17 September, so just over 2 weeks later, the USSR joined their Nazi partners in the Fourth Partition of Poland, invading from the east. Facing a two-front war against much larger armies with more modern arms and equipment, and without promised assistance from the west, the Poles evacuated as much of their armies and their government as they could. The Government-in-Exile eventually settled in London for the duration of the war, as did most of the Polish Navy, Air Force, and some of its army. The Government-in-Exile eventually settled in Britain for the duration of the war, as did most of the Polish Navy, Air Force, and some of its army. They all made a major difference in operations in the West, most famously in the Air Battle of Britain. But even before the final collapse of Poland on 27 September 1939, General Michal Tadeusz Tokarzewski-Karaszewicz, second in command of the Army of Warsaw, set up a resistance movement called Służba Zwycięstwa Polski, or Polish Victory Service. On 17 November, General Wladyslaw Sikorski, General Inspector of the Polish Armed Forces and Prime Minister of the Polish Government-in-Exile, ordered this group to be reorganized as the Związek Walki Zbrojnej, or Armed Resistance. 2.5 years later, on 14 February 1942, it was renamed again, for the last time, the Armia Krajowa, Home Army. This was not the only resistance group in Poland, especially at the beginning of the war, but gradually smaller and regional groups began to coalesce or even merge with the AK. That's the short form I'll use interchangeably with Home Army. The one group that didn't is the one you can probably expect, the communist resistance groups. The AK was loyal to the Polish Government-in-Exile in London, as I said, but the Communist Polish People's Army took their direction from Moscow. See, the USSR had occupied eastern Poland in 1939, but by 1941, when the USSR again became an enemy of Nazi Germany, its former partner, that changed, and they started to support communist resistance groups. This is where it gets really complicated because when the USSR occupied eastern Poland in 1939, they imprisoned, deported, and murdered tens of thousands of Polish people. Many of those deported Poles, especially those with any military experience or inclinations, would eventually become fighters in various armies, and we'll get to that. One thing that all the resistance groups in Poland shared, whether they were communist or not, was intense popular support. The Poles bitterly opposed German and Soviet occupation. We have to think about the resistance falling into three broad categories with very fluid boundaries. So first, think of undercover operatives, actual resistance fighters, people who lived secretly in cities and towns under false identities. Then there were what were called the forest people, in other words, partisans, some of them uniformed, often composed of Polish armed forces members who escaped capture. They fought a secret hidden war against the occupiers and committed some spectacular operations that I'll describe later. Then there were volunteers, usually civilians living mostly in cities and towns, who performed a range of support duties for the fighters, such as couriers, coders, decoders, medics, and just secretly housing other AK members. Now, when I said the AK was loyal to the government in London, that doesn't mean they took direction assiduously. Necessarily, they had to act with a lot of independence, a lot of initiative on their own part. And sometimes these were contrary to the wishes of Sikorski and the other political leaders, but necessarily so. Let me explain. While the AK was a large force with nearly 400,000 members, it was poorly armed, and they were on the ground, under occupation. Most of their arms were small arms, like rifles, handguns, and submachine guns, sometimes, rarely. No artillery, no tanks, no air force, and minimal support from allies. Because of this, the Government-in-Exile defined the AK's main roles. First, partisan warfare against the occupiers, including attacks on German units, sabotage, self-defense, and freeing of prisoners and hostages. Then, rebuilding of underground armed forces. In preparation for, the third part of it, a general population-wide rising and restoring of an independent country. To quote from The Forgotten Holocaust by Robert Lucas. Following the Polish defeat by the Germans in September 1939, Sikorski did not want the ZWK, the group at the time, to engage in any operations that invited Nazi repression. When Sikorski, another political leader in London, outlined possible activities for the ZWZ in January 1940, he gave priority to intelligence, followed by sabotage. Precisely because of the inherent risks of Nazi retribution, he gave a lower priority to retaliatory and diversionary attacks. When the ZWZ conducted sabotage, Sikorski directed them to do it in such a way as to minimize the repercussions from the Nazis. He suggested adding sugar or pitch to benzene and sand to the oil cans of freight cars, and infecting the grain of cows used by the military. End quote. Cattle were not the only victims of bacterial sabotage by Polish resistance. Over 4 months in 1943, an AK operative, codenamed Jan, infected 600 Germans with typhoid fever. The AK and the resistance in general enjoyed widespread support among the populace. It's not hard to understand why. Every nation wants independence and dignity, of course, and in Poland's case, the German occupation was brutal. Nazi ideology saw the Poles and all Slavic people as an inferior so-called race to be enslaved and ultimately eliminated. Hitler wanted Poland, Ukraine, and other lands eastward as Lebensraum, living space for Germans, and began forcing Poles out of their homes in favor of ethnic Germans and German transplants. I'll get to a notable example in a couple of minutes. In their invasion, the Nazis destroyed dozens of towns along with the armed forces. They murdered officers and soldiers who had surrendered, imprisoned or killed intelligentsia, and sent more than 30,000 Polish people to concentration camps, including Auschwitz. The Soviets did not treat Poland any gentler. In fact, after the Nazis and communists had dismembered the country, Poles crossed the border between Soviet and German-controlled areas in hopes of better treatment, in both directions. In the words of Antony Beevor from his definitive history, The Second World War, Polish patriotism was perhaps romantic in some ways, but it remained astonishingly resolute through the darkest days of both Nazi and Soviet oppression. In addition to the mass and individual killings which followed the German invasion, over 30,000 Poles were sent to camps, many to the new camp of Auschwitz. Although Poland's army was crushed in September 1939, a new underground resistance movement was created very soon afterwards. At its height, the Home Army reached nearly 400,000 members. End quote. Now, it wasn't just the members of the AK who carried out sabotage. Says Robert Lucas in The Forgotten Holocaust, virtually the entire Polish nation sought to frustrate, delay, damage, or destroy whatever the Germans needed of economic value for the war economy. When it came to grain deliveries to the Germans, Polish peasants operated under the slogan, as little, as late, and as bad as possible. End quote. Another slogan was, quote, a Pole in servitude works slowly. End quote. Another resistance organization, the Directorate of Civil Resistance, burned documents on quota deliveries for the German food when they requisitioned food or whatever. To quote once more from Robert Lucas, one agricultural worker set fire to harvested crops, while another removed parts of a potato digging machine that resulted in ruining 2 wagon loads of potatoes that had to be left in the field to rot. Both of them paid with their lives. The sabotage activities of ordinary Polish citizens were so extensive that, according to the chief of the Directorate of Civil Resistance, if a balance sheet could be drawn up, it would be found that it was worth at least several divisions fighting at the front. End quote. The AK membership doubled from 100,000 members in February 1942 to 200,000 by early 1943, and by the summer of 1944, its peak membership of close to 400,000. Members came from every part of society, peasants, landholding farmers, urban workers, teachers, professors, every stratum. About a tenth, so about 40,000, were women. They mostly did communications, coding, and transporting messages. Women were also medics and nurses, and some performed sabotage and even combat operations, particularly during the Warsaw uprising of August 1944. Of course, we'll get to that, but not today.
As Scott elegantly describes in each episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was truly gargantuan, both in terms of its geography and its destructiveness. But given that there is so much territory to cover, and that so many millions of men were involved in the fighting, it's perhaps inevitable that some battles from the Eastern Front get overlooked. I'm David Sumner, and I'm the host of Europe at War, a weekly podcast exploring lesser-known battles and stories of the Second World War with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. From the drama of thousands of trapped German soldiers and terrified civilians attempting to break out of the Halbe pocket, to the unexpected and blistering counterattack launched by German forces on the Red Army during the Battle of Bautzen, many of the Eastern Front's most dramatic battles, particularly those which happened towards the end of the war, have long been neglected by historians, and their stories have remained untold until now. So to hear these incredible tales from the Eastern Front and more, check out Europe at War, available on all podcast platforms. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show.
Let's talk about the military operations of the AK. The Home Army was very effective in sabotage operations, such as blowing up trains and railroad tracks and stations and other parts of the rail and transport infrastructure, especially around important hubs like Warsaw and Lublin. This continued throughout the occupation. One resistance group, the Union for Revenge, carried out numerous operations across Poland. In February 1941 alone, their activities crippled 43% of all locomotives in the General Government. That's the area under a quasi-military control. The Germans kind of opened themselves up to a lot of this sabotage. They employed, or maybe it's more accurate to say enslaved, some 30,000 Polish railroad workers, most of them being members of the Socialist Party. And naturally, they did their best to delay or damage German rail transport in their country. They could disable a locomotive by contaminating the grease in the railroad engine, for example. Statistics, Germans were great at collecting statistics, show that while damage could put a locomotive out of commission for an average of 14 hours in 1940, in 1942 that average delay rose to 5 days, and in 1943, 2 entire weeks. Operation Garland, or Winnicz in Polish, happened on the night of 7th to 8th October 1942. 40 men in 2 groups blew up railway tracks on both sides of the Vistula River near Warsaw. While no partisans were hurt in the operation, the Germans retaliated by killing 89 Polish prisoners. Later in the winter, Operation Wreath severed railway lines in Warsaw, temporarily preventing the Nazis from sending urgently needed supplies to Stalingrad. By 1944, there was an average of 10 explosions on Polish railroads every day. The AK did not limit its attacks to railroads and machines either. They targeted German soldiers and officials, as well as police officers, SS and SA members, officials in the labor office and railroad system, and anyone they considered to be collaborating with the occupiers. The AK killed 361 gendarmes in 1943 and another 584 in the first 6 months of 1944, which is about the time the Red Army arrived again. We'll get to that. In the first half of 1943, there were 123 German casualties in occupied Poland. Only 3 of them were not German soldiers, officers, or working in some way for the Nazi regime. By that point, the AK was killing 10 Germans every day. High-profile casualties included several German mayors and the director of the Warsaw Labor Office. Perhaps the most spectacular reprisal killing was General Franz Kutschera, the SS and police leader in Warsaw, who was responsible for inaugurating street executions in the city. The Germans retaliated for that assassination by killing 300 Poles, regardless of whether they were connected with the AK in any way. Poland became, against its will I must stress, the nexus of the Holocaust, the place where most of the worst abuses happened. One part of the German strategy was to force Jewish people to live in overcrowded ghettos. In April 1943, the people in the Warsaw Ghetto rebelled against the Nazis. The AK and the Polish communist resistance groups smuggled small arms, pistols, and revolvers into the ghetto at great risk to themselves. The Nazis responded by burning the entire area to the ground and blowing up cellars and sewers where survivors hid. During the battle, units of the AK joined in by sniping at the SS from outside the ghetto wall. 3 units even tried to breach the walls with grenades. After 29 days, the rebellion collapsed. More than 13,000 people in the ghetto died in the fighting, 6,000 from fires or smoke inhalation. The Nazis deported most of the roughly 50,000 survivors to extermination camps, like Treblinka. And the German casualties in this whole operation? 110. 17 killed, 93 wounded. Beyond Barbarossa covered the uprising in detail in episode 46. Another long-term operation was attacks on guard stations on the border between the General Government and the Reichskommissariats Ost and Ukraine, areas under direct military occupation. Between August 1943 and February 1944, the AK destroyed 13 such outposts with few losses of their own. In one operation, on the night of 20 to 21 August 1943, partisans destroyed 7 German guard stations in one night. And that fall, the AK attacked guard posts along the Slovakian border. A key part of the Nazis' plan for Poland was to Germanize it, which meant removing not only the Jewish people, largely by murdering them, but also Slavs and other non-Germans. As part of that plan, the General Government, the German administration of occupied Poland, in November 1941 chose the fertile Zamość region in southeast Poland near Lublin for colonization. They decided to expel the local population, replace them with 60,000 ethnic Germans, and rename the city Himmlerstadt after the odious head of the SS. To make room for the colonizers, 60,000, planned, the Nazis expelled more than 110,000 Poles. Some were resettled, many were shot. Most were sent to Germany as forced labor or to concentration camps. Then the SS razed villages and murdered anyone who resisted. The Germans also kidnapped 4,454 children who met their criteria and sent them to be indoctrinated to become German. Only 800 of these children returned to Poland after the war. Naturally, the Polish people resisted. Thousands escaped into the forests, sometimes setting their own houses on fire as they left. Polish people ransomed thousands of expelled children on their way to concentration or extermination camps, which meant that the Polish people bribed the guards to take the children to safety. The AK and the communist Gwardia Ludowa attacked the German forces as well as the colonists. This led to the first large-scale partisan battles of the war in the East, starting in December 1942. A number of battles between AK and German units continued for over a year. Eventually, the Germans launched 2 major anti-partisan operations, Sturmwind or Hurricane 1 and 2. These culminated on 25th June 1944 in the Battle of Osuchi in the Zamość region, where 1,200 AK partisans attacked 30,000 German soldiers. The partisans were eventually surrounded, with 400 killed. The remaining surrendered, and the Germans murdered many of them on the spot. But that June, the Germans were facing another major challenge farther east. We'll get to it, but I think you know what it is. In the end, the colonization project failed. Fewer than 9,000 Germans settled in Zamość, and the Germans gave up the project. While those partisan attacks were thrilling, the AK's major contribution to the Allied war effort was in intelligence, and that contribution was immense. So let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll take a closer look at the AK's intelligence operations. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Thanks for coming back to part 2 of this episode on the Polish Armia Krajowa, the Home Army. As I said, one of the AK's most important contributions to the overall war effort was in intelligence. Polish agents radioed reports continually to London about German troop and materiel movements. This was obviously very risky, and hundreds of radio operators were captured, tortured, and killed by the Gestapo, Abwehr, German military intelligence, or the SS. Quote, the AK sent more important reports by radio. Beginning in the autumn of 1940, it sent weekly reports to London. During the period 1942 to 1944, the volume of intelligence traffic reached 300 reports every month and constituted 40 to 50% of all the radio correspondence between Warsaw and London. 2 times a day during the war, the Poles radioed London weather data, which, combined with what the British received from Stockholm and Istanbul, enabled Air Force meteorologists to forecast the weather over Germany and to plan more accurately missions over German-occupied Europe. End quote. The Poles also sent information by courier, which was also very risky, even from their own people, from the forgotten Holocaust. One of the ways to get intelligence agents into the Reich was to have them volunteer for periodic German demands for Polish labor in Germany. Since most Poles avoided volunteering for such work and regarded those who did as traitors, it was not an easy task for these agents. They risked injury or sometimes death from their own kinsmen. End quote. These couriers were called, and I apologize for mangling this word, Sikorski, the secret unseen. Elzbieta Zawacka, Agent Zoe, was the most famous courier. Fluent in German and with nerves of steel and elan, she made over 100 deliveries of secret messages and intelligence, even making multiple trips to Berlin from Warsaw undetected. She was also instrumental in organizing intelligence, courier, and support networks. You can find out more about her in episode 62, my conversation with the author of Agent Zoe, Clare Mulley. It's hard to overstate the value of Polish intelligence. Even before the outbreak of war in September 1939, the Poles were delivering priceless information that would change the course of history. Quote, Polish authorities in London regarded the intelligence gathering role of the ZWZ, or AK, as critically important. In January 1940, the Government-in-Exile listed intelligence as the primary task of the military underground, a view underscored again after the fall of France. British intelligence agencies considered Polish intelligence regarding the German order of battle as, quote, the best source of information, end quote. Quoting again from the British, reports from Polish sources are considered as the most valuable of all we received. They contain entirely trustworthy information. Among other notable accomplishments of Polish intelligence were the detailed reports it provided the British concerning German preparations for Operation Barbarossa. The British, in turn, sent the information to Stalin, who, oddly enough, did not alert his armed forces. End quote. From The Forgotten Holocaust. It was the AK that first brought information and evidence about German concentration and extermination camps and about the Holocaust to the West's attention. Again, back to Richard Lucas. The Poles made their greatest intelligence coup even before the war broke out. Polish cryptologists Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rzycki, and Henryk Zygalski, who worked in the intelligence bureau of the Polish General Staff, succeeded in duplicating the German cipher machine Enigma, thus enabling the Poles to begin reading German radiograms as early as 1932. End quote. The Enigma machine, I'm sure you've heard of it, was the device the Germans used to code their radio signals. They scrambled the letters of the alphabet. The receiver needed another Enigma machine with the same settings to descramble the message. Changing the settings of the machines daily prevented easy decoding. And each German Enigma operator had a set of secret key lists so they would know what settings to use each day. Figuring out the system without the Germans' knowledge gave the Allies a significant advantage during the war. Historian Antony Beevor described the influence that Polish intelligence had on the British. Polish resistance was an inspiration for SOE, Special Operations Executive, the British espionage, sabotage, and resistance support organization during the war. A Polish section had been set up in SOE, but its role was simply to work with the Polish Army's 6th Bureau in London and provide support. No military mission was sent to occupied Poland, and as a result the Poles themselves ran everything. After the great contribution of Polish pilots in the Battle of Britain, SOE managed to persuade the Royal Air Force to convert a Whitley bomber with additional fuel tanks so they could make the long round trip from a base in Scotland. The first drop of Polish couriers took place on 15 February 1941. Parachute containers were also designed to drop arms and explosives to what became the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. End quote. This value continued through the entire war, again from the forgotten Holocaust. In response to the Allied air bombardment of Germany, Hitler intended to launch a decisive attack on England by hurling V-1 and V-2 rockets at the British. He gave top priority to the German rocket program. Thanks largely to intelligence received from Polish sources, the British got valuable information that enabled them, on August 17, 1943, to launch a massive air attack on Peenemünde, where the rockets were being tested. End quote. Polish intelligence gathered parts of V-2 test rockets from where they fell around the test site in central Poland. In May 1944, they recovered a largely intact rocket and took it to secret laboratories for analysis. On the night of 25 to 26 July 1944, a specially adapted transport plane flew to an abandoned airfield in Poland and brought it back for examination by Allied scientists. While the AK was opposed to Soviet occupation as well as German, that relationship changed after Operation Barbarossa in 1941. After that, until 1944, all of Poland was occupied by Germany. With the USSR becoming an ally of Britain, that created a fraught relationship with the Polish government in exile. The USSR never recognized the London-based Polish government and actively worked to set up and support a communist government for Poland. Stalin repeatedly characterized the AK as bandits and fascists because, to the Soviets, anyone who was anti-communist was a fascist. And that's something that's persisting today. After 1941, the London-based government ordered the AK to look into conducting operations east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line. East of that had been under USSR command, but in that brief period from 1939 to 1941. The objective was, as Richard Lucas puts it, help mellow the Soviets substantially enough whereby the Poles might gain respectable concessions. End quote. Then, in April 1943, the Germans, still firmly in control of Poland, announced they had discovered mass graves of Polish officers in the forests of Katyn. These people had been murdered by the NKVD, the Soviet security police, in 1939, during that invasion. The Soviets, of course, denied that they were responsible and blamed the Germans. The Polish government in exile in London demanded an investigation by the International Red Cross. To quote again from Antony Beevor, the British were acutely embarrassed. Churchill suspected that the Soviets were capable of such an act, but he felt unable to confront Stalin, especially at a time when he had to admit once again that an invasion of France was impossible that year. Further disasters for the Poles soon followed in June. The Germans in Warsaw managed to arrest the commander and other leaders of the Home Army, but far greater tragedies for Poland lay ahead. They knew by then that they could not count on their British and American allies against the Soviets. The brutal realpolitik of the Second World War had made American and British collaboration with Stalin essential, since the Red Army had broken the back of the Wehrmacht at an appalling cost. End quote. So clearly, cooperation between the AK and the Red Army was going to be difficult to accomplish. But as the USSR and the Western Allies, including the Polish government-in-exile, had a common enemy in Nazi Germany, cooperation was unavoidable. Still, the Poles were under no illusions about the Communists becoming the next threat. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army was in Poland. This is when the AK was supposed to start cooperating with them at a tactical level. This was also the moment the AK and the Polish government in exile had been waiting for, the time when the Germans were weaker, when a nationwide Polish uprising could throw off the occupiers and restore a free, independent nation. But before they can, there are a few important events that have to happen in June 1944. And that's what we're going to talk about in a series of upcoming episodes. So come back in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that, and you get the idea. Come back for the thrilling action and deep dives into the details with erudite guests. To make sure you don't miss a single exciting episode, hit that follow or subscribe button. And you can add Beyond Barbarossa to your favorite podcast list on FeedSpot for notifications of new episodes in your email. Thank you for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. If you have a moment, please leave a rating on whichever podcasting platform you listen on. That really helps other people find Beyond Barbarossa, if they don't know about the only English language podcast that focuses on the whole Eastern Front of World War II. As usual, I've put maps and photos on the webpage for this episode, beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. I want to thank all of you who support the podcast through Patreon. Patreon supporters get episodes early, ad-free, and with images. Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and choose the level of support you want. Do you have something to say, a comment, question, or, as I said before, I hate to admit the possibility, but I am only human. Do you have a correction? Please let me know. Reach out by email to scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. You can also find me on Blue Sky, Scott the Writer, Threads, and Instagram. I'm looking forward to your input. Remember everyone, Canada is a free, independent, sovereign country, and we will never be the 51st part of anything. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Till next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina et vive le Canada.